These days, I'm compelled to speak to people that are not from my world. And I notice the incommensurability of worlds when I speak. And people expect everything I say to be legible, intelligible, or appropriate to their own histories. What I want to say right now, and my work is about shocking the familiar, is about disturbing the subjectivity of what is known and showing up with a world that will not be reduced to the dictates and the performances and the moral dilemmas of the West. This is not an attempt to pathologize the West. This is not even an attempt to pathologize British colonial rule, right? I've written about that. This is not to say they're bad and we're good. This is not that. But this is to speak about the fact that there are multiple lineages, there are multiple genealogies, and the attempt to reduce one to another fosters and instigates a recolonization of possibility.
Like wisdom, good relationships are hard-earned. They are practiced through failure and misunderstanding, for richer or poorer, for better or worse. You know the rest. Kin is a relational becoming along those lines. We can enact our kinship with our fellow earthlings. We can deny it, but we shouldn't mistake it for something static. It's never that.
I want to ask a question about Black Lives Matter, but to whom does it matter? In what ways is the legibility of Black suffering part of the institution that makes Black suffering possible? Saidiya Hartman, a Black professor, speaks about hypervisibility. And hypervisibility is basically the idea that sometimes in centering Black suffering, we trivialize Black suffering. We make it a fetish so that every time it's presented, it's just an eye-rolling response. Here it goes again, right? So how do we seize attention is the question I'm asking, without being legible, fully legible or malleable to attention? How do we break attention?
Number 3, relying on senses other than sight. Okay, so we're vision, we're binocular, creatures, we human beings, that is, we rely on vision for so much of our sensory input. And so it's good to step away and to deny ourselves that sometimes. This was particularly came home to me when I went on a trip up to Big Sur, and so beautiful. I was stunned, but I realized that in looking at these aquamarine ocean waters, these cliff sides, these cypress, trees that were bent like, in their forms twisted with the wind, that I was relying on my vision and I was kind of collecting things. It was like a grasping, with vision, I think that's easy to fall into, where we're trying to capture, the gaze, can be sort of unidirectional. So I just closed my eyes and became receptive. And really, it's, what might you hear with your body? And then the experience of that place became so much deeper to me.
If being correct is the essence of our politics, then one day we will find ourselves incarcerated by our correctness. And that may be the point of losing our way and finding new ways of being in the world, is to disturb the idea that we can arrive summarily at any final notion of what it means to be in the world.
I think about Keith Basso's Wisdom Sits in Places here, where the landscape is storied and these different features in the geography of the Dene people. He says these landscapes shoot arrows. They keep people responsible. The depth of those stories and the names of those places identify, the name identifies immediately a whole narrative in the people's minds that keeps them accountable, that stalks them. It's STALKS, stalks them. So a literal landmark, because it leaves a mark on us.
Kinship is not just us and them or us and the others, in the pleasantly entangling ways we speak about these matters. Kinship is the idea, is not even the idea, is not summarily or exclusively the idea that we are not alone, but it is the idea that we cannot do anything except we do with, right? There is no doing that is not a doing with. There is no behaving that is not a behaving with. There is no becoming that is not a becoming with.
Out of the cognitive brain into the somatic mind. This is an important one for me as a person who tends to privilege my thought over my body, as though it's somehow more reliable or worthy of attention than felt experience. So I'm learning how the body itself, our sensory experience of our kinful world, can be a medium for mind.
But the notion of kinship is that we are imbricated within and nested within very strange and queer assemblages of power, principalities and power. That means that sometimes when we think we're doing good, we are acting with something larger, and that's something that exceeds us, that actually reinforces the realities we're trying to leave behind.
I, for example, was inspired by Nan Shepherd in her book, The Living Mountain, and thanks to Robert McFarland for turning me on to that book, which builds to a conclusion, a really stunning conclusion, a chapter called Being. Her description of barefoot walking and what long periods of walking can do is worth quoting at length. For in this kind of walking, she says, one walks the flesh transparent.
We need cracks. Cracks are socio-material places of impairment, decolonial impairment. When our bodies, and by bodies, I do not mean the habitual forms with which we think we show up in the world, but I'm talking about the intensity of fields in their ongoing maturing, right? When our bodies sprout new possible ethnographies for us to be in the world.
Boundaries are just as important to relation as porosity, right? The key here is not to lose sight of either. And the reason that I emphasize porosity in this talk is because that's the side that often gets neglected.
So we don't live in a world of correct Platonic things and incorrect Platonic things, right? We live in a world that is so politically, ontologically fluid that to stick to an analysis of it is to lose sight of the promiscuity of it. And so the invitation of storytelling is not just to narrate our experiences, but to disturb our centrality. Is to speak to the idea that there are much more things that will not be seen in history, that history is actually, in a sense, a formulation of the present, right? That when we're speaking about the past, we're not approaching the past, we're creating temporalities together.